Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw.
I remember from an early age having albums, photo albums, and those albums there were photos of me from earlier than I could remember, but there was photos of my parents when they were children, and it was just, this amazing storytelling thing that I remember. And so, I became interested and did a bit of photography myself, never very seriously. But yeah, it was a fun way to capture life moments and memories and to go back and reflect.
Nice. Great. Or is that it? You want to continue?
No, I mean, just to mention that, later I began to appreciate people who are actually good at it, and see them capture images that would tell a story.
Nice. Well, okay. So Lance Robinson, thank you for joining me on Shooting It Raw, the podcast that we start with photos. We just basically start with 4 photos, and that way use that as the portals or doorways to kind of learn about you, and hopefully ultimately inspiring listeners to make every second count, to understand, how you think, how you make sense of the world. And I don't research my guests. I didn't look at the images beforehand. So we're just kind of going on a bit of a tour with you as the guide. So thank you for joining me. This is great.
Good. I'm looking forward to it. This is a fun format you've got.
Okay, great. So I know. Okay, so you sound Canadian. Where are you from? Where are you? Are you Canadian? Maybe you're not. Maybe you're north of the U.S. But where are you from, and where are you right now? So I'm in Hong Kong, and you're in.
I'm Canadian. I'm originally from Saskatchewan, but I now live in Thunder Bay, which is in northwestern Ontario.
Represent. Lance Robinson. Oh, beautiful. Oh, this is great. Okay, so it's so I have to describe the photo. So if somebody's listening, they go, okay, what is this all about? So it's a beautiful sunset. There's at the bottom, almost half of the image looks like grasses. It could be a wheat field, but it's kind of odd, very faintly greenish. It's a very it's a landscape shot, so very kind of the format is a long rectangle. The horizon is perfectly straight. There's like distant trees, forests in silhouette, and the sky is this dramatic sunset with this beautiful cloud and the sun orange and golden with reds, and just glorious sunset. I think it's a sunset. Is it a sunrise? Sunset? I think it's a sunset. I put my money on a sunset. So
yeah, I think it's a sunset. Yeah.
So what's this?
This is a kind of landscape you're likely to see in a lot of parts of southern Saskatchewan or many places across the Canadian prairies. This flat land. In this case, you've got some trees on the horizon, probably like a shelter break that the farmer has planted. But I included this because I think that prairie landscape just influenced me so much. I grew up in the city, but our house was at the edge of the city, and I could step out from my house onto the street. I could look to the west, and I could see, like, beyond the edge of our block, that was the edge of the city, the end of our block. And then I could see like 5-6 kilometers or more off to the horizon. Just flat land. The sky is big and bold, and clouds like that, like we see in this picture, just have a life of their own. I think that landscape just sort of wove its way into my soul, and it had influences, I think, in a subtle way on where I went eventually with career and other kinds of stuff.
So I grew up in Montreal, so fellow Canadian.
Yeah.
I think a few episodes or weeks ago, I had another guest who was also, I mean, wasn't living in the prairies, but I think Saskatchewan, and then also influenced by that landscape. Weaving into that, I was listening to a podcast about the Everglades, right? And the Everglades are just a massive sea of swamp, right? But also low grass, lowlands, right? Flat. Okay, so why don't you convey to somebody from Southeast Asia or from the Middle East or somebody who has no frame of reference, right? Like essentially it's a flat, straight land, but with big skies. So maybe somebody from the desert, a desert plateau or something might be able to connect with that idea, right? So as you mentioned writing earlier, as somebody who puts ideas into words, why don't you riff a little bit about how the landscape shaped you? Because it's one thing to say that, the landscape really impacted on how I see the world and all this stuff. But why don't you make that real for somebody? Like, how does that manifest?
I've been to some of the places that people think of as some of the most beautiful places in Canada. Think of the Rocky Mountains, the west coast of British Columbia, and those are beautiful, beautiful places. But I often feel, as much as I enjoy the beauty in those places, I often feel just a tiny bit claustrophobic. Being in the mountains in Western Alberta or in British Columbia, and in some places you can be a place where the sun rises at 10 a.m. and sets at 4 p.m. just because you're down at the bottom of this steep valley.
Right.
And I feel better when I can see in miles and miles in every direction. And I don't know if this is honest or not, but I feel like the sky has this sense of possibility.
Okay.
And I think that sense of possibility sort of wove its way into how I see the world, and just applying that in different areas, my life, the future of ourselves as a species. You name it, that there is a wealth of possibilities out there. Our future as human beings is this wide open skyscape that we could take in whatever direction we wanted to, if we really wanted to. That freedom there, I think, is sort of brought itself into how I see the world.
Interesting. Okay, so one side of so on the one hand, you mentioned claustrophobia, right? So yes, so there is something about, and I've been to BC. I love BC. It's this dramatic. It's a high drama. Everything's really big. So on the one hand, there is that sense of claustrophobia. Yeah, I get it. But the other side of claustrophobia is agoraphobia, right? The fear of wide open spaces, which to you is no. That's not a fear, right? So have you been out in the high, crazy open ocean, like so far away from land that there's only water and sky?
Yes. I mean, not much, but yeah, briefly. And yeah, it's a similar feeling. I don't feel quite as comfortable because it's not solid ground under my feet, but the vista, the expanse, it feels very similar.
So, okay. So, so let me interrupt. I do that all the time, by the way. I interrupt my guests. I'm a total shit host.
Go ahead.
Okay. So because we're getting to know you. Okay. So, I put it out there that you mentioned writing, and so, before we started recording, I come from the world of writing as well, right? So my first degree was in creative writing, and there's something about studying creative writing in Canada that really, there's a pillar or a value in Canadian writing that is really anchored to the landscape. Right, to the land mass, the Canada is a massive place, with quite a range in geography. And so, what's your link to either the historical writers, the Canadian historical writers, or how did you fall into writing? what I'm trying to do is trying to get you to paint a sort of sense of why writing and expression for you is so anchored to wide open spaces.
Wow, that's an interesting one. I don't. I mean, maybe it's that that wide open landscape, that sense of possibilities. Also, one way to think about that freedom and that open space is imagination. And I've always been attracted to the most imaginative, not necessarily naturalistic forms of literature. So, science fiction and fantasy particularly. Having that sense of awe and wonder, and I think you get that whether it's watching a thunderstorm approach and watching it approach for like 30 minutes because you can see it 10, 15 kilometers away, or is looking at the night sky at night. That that sense of awe is there. And when I encountered that in writing, and very different kind of writing, but science fiction, not necessarily science fiction about prairie landscapes, which I don't think there's a whole lot of that, but that the sense of awe was what I think I intuitively recognized, and I wanted to create that myself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm assuming we're going to dive into your books or so. Okay. So how long have you been writing? Like how long have you been expressing yourself in writing? Are you, I mean, I don't know anything about you. Or maybe you're a journalist by trade. I don't like.
Sure. So no, I write science fiction primarily, and I've been writing in one form or another since I was a kid. I can think of particular teachers in grade school who encouraged me, complimented my writing, or told me to do more. One teacher who told us about a contest that CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, was running. They had a kids show, and kids could submit stories. And the show was called Pencil Box. And Pencil Box would select stories that kids submitted and would dramatize them. One of our teachers told us about this contest, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try that. And they picked a story.
Oh, wow!
So I had a story on CBC.
Respect.
On after school kids show. But I think I got more serious about it in high school. I had one particular English teacher who exposed us to some interesting literature and stuff that wasn't like core curriculum kind of stuff. We read Dune in high school.
Oh, nice.
So, I'm reading things like that, then that sealed the deal for me. That okay, science fiction. This is what I love. This is what I want to do.
Nice. Okay. Well, because we're doing what I love, which is meeting people and talking about art and expression and thought, let's move on to the next photo. Wait a second. So this photo is okay. Okay, so the horizon line is a bit off kilter because whoever made the photo probably was doing a sort of action in the landscapes shot. It's an interesting image because half the ground is like quite barren, not super alive. It looks like a high desert. Far off in the distance is like a mound, like a butte, I guess some might call it. The sky is filled with clouds. The bottom half is brown, lots of browns. There's a date on the image that says 2007, either June or May. And in the photo are 4 people and maybe, I don't know, some kind of pack animal. I'm not really sure. The 4 people are kind of hiking through what's a really not very, I mean, it looks like a trail, but it's like a trail to nowhere, to that butte that's looks like at least 5 kilometers away or something. Very, very dramatic shot. Probably done at about late morning, early afternoon. Yeah, this is a really interesting. Okay, what's this story, Lance? What is this?
So this is northern Kenya.
Oh, wow. Wow.
A district in Kenya called Marsabit. Mm-hmm. Well, now it's a county. I mean, they changed their governance system a bit. But yeah, so it was Marsabit district at the time, Marsabit County. That's in north central Kenya. It's the driest part of Kenya. And parts of the Marsabit landscape, I mean, parts of it, if you could just ignore a few sticks of grass sticking up here and there, you might wonder if you're actually on the moon or on
Yeah.
Mars or something.
Yeah. It's really, really quite barren.
Yeah, very rugged landscape. They get very little rainfall. It's not barren because it's mismanaged. It's just that's how much rainfall they get.
Mhm.
Just the air circulation patterns and currents and sort of global climate patterns of which way the wind blows and where the wet air is and isn't. This place has been dry for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. Yeah, I was doing my PhD field research. So I've got a PhD in natural resources and environmental management, and I spent a year in Kenya. Most of that time in Marsabit in northern Kenya. Went down to the city, to Nairobi, once in a while for a week or so at a time, but mostly I was up in Marsabit and working most of the time with nomadic pastoralist groups. So these are people who make their livelihood not from farming, but from moving around with their livestock.
Wow.
So I think in this case we've got looks like three donkeys.
Okay.
This ethnic group, their sort of their key cultural animal is camels rather than donkeys, but people who own donkeys as well, they're a bit more affordable than camels. And I mean, aside from my research and being important for me professionally, so I was advancing in my career in environment and natural resource management. I think the landscape here too was just so amazing, so rugged. And the Gabra people, this ethnic group, the ones who still live a traditional life, are just so tough and so amazing that and the knowledge they have is how to create a livelihood in this place where any of the rest of us would, we'd be dead of dying of thirst within a few days, if not less. So just working with them and learning some of the issues about how policies are affecting them and their livelihoods, and just more sort of interesting and human things of their day-to-day life, it was a fabulous, wonderful experience. And again, I was, I think it was part of that landscape. I eventually, as I moved, I wasn't writing professionally. I went to university and I studied planning, and then I went in to do my PhD and studied environment and natural resources, and working in the environment field. But I didn't set out to work in rangeland ecosystems necessarily at the beginning, but I kept getting drawn into these kinds of landscapes. So, I don't have a whole lot of experience working with, not nearly as much working in forest ecosystems or coastal peoples and coral reefs. Most of my work has been in like prairies, deserts, or some kind of rangeland or grassland kinds of ecosystems, and the people who live there and make these places their home.
Lance, I'm eating this up. Not expected. Arguably, your PhD thesis was your first book, right? I mean, that's really a massive exercise in writing. I love the fact that I have no idea what I'm going to see, and all of a sudden, I'm looking at this shot. Because one thing now that you mention it, is that you walking? Because there's somebody wearing like a beige sun hat, beige kind of shirt, beige pants. I mean, you're like, I'm protecting myself from the sun. You're like, no way, the sun isn't getting me. And you've got a backpack.
Yeah.
And in front of you are these three sort of pastoralists wearing what almost looks like a sarong, but the clothing draped over their heads and their shoulders. And it's a crazy shot in the sense that, it's so barren, and it's kind of like you guys are forging ahead. Did you make it to that faraway hillside, or were you just like...
So I think, so this would have been, we were returning from a watering point.
Mm-hmm.
They had their camp. I wouldn't call it a village. It's like a hamlet really, but it's a mobile hamlet. So they would, they'd move every few weeks or so.
Mm-hmm.
They'd use up the grass in that area. ticks or whatnot, other parasites from the animals would start to build up in one place. So every few weeks they would move to another place. Their camp was, and we can't see it in this picture. I think there's like a bit of a rise and like a tiny little dip in the land somewhere near the horizon. But I think their camp was about a kilometer before that hill.
Okay.
And there's a watering point. So we're coming back from a watering point, and it's not very visible in the photos, but the donkeys are carrying these jerry cans full of water, and so they're carrying the jerry cans back to their camp.
And now you're in Thunder Bay. Is that right?
And now I'm in Thunder Bay. Yeah, very different kind of place.
Yeah, I know. Okay. And what was the title of your thesis?
Oh, it was a while ago now. How Gabra pastoralists influence resilience.
Okay.
I mean, there's a longer that
yeah, I'm sure.
Been the subtitle. The title was longer, but yeah, that was part of it.
Okay.
So I was my work was revolved around social ecological resilience, trying to understand what it is that makes the systems that keep us alive, and the ecosystems and the social systems, and how those are interrelated, and what it is that makes those things work and last and deal with shocks and stresses. And
wow.
And I was looking at how Gabra people manage their ecosystems and keep themselves resilient.
Right. So are you teaching at Lakehead, for example? Like right now? No? Okay.
No.
Okay, so as a good Canadian, I have this strong conservation and science-based aspect as well, interest. I love the idea that what you seem to specialize back then, at least, I don't know if that's still you, but it's like the kind of the mix of, it seems to be like resource management, conservation, but also it sounds like climate and I don't know. I mean, so take us to school, like take me to school. What can I learn about in terms of that sort of that intersection or mix of disciplines?
Sure. So, I mean, my work has mostly revolved around sort of governance and institutions and planning, sort of how human beings organize themselves and make decisions has been the focus of my research work. But most of the time I'm approaching it with this sort of systems thinking, complex systems kind of lens. So trying to understand all the intricate ways that ecosystems and climate systems and political systems and cultural systems, how they're all interlinked and how each one influences the other. So, I mean, that's been the focus of my research work. And I don't know, I think regardless of what kind of ecosystem or climate you live in, I think there's a lot to learn from these kinds of mobile pastoralists.
Okay.
Because, coming from a comparatively pleasant kind of climate, my reaction would be, this is so rugged. These guys are so tough to live in this climate. How do they cope? But, for them, it's not coping. This is our home.
Yeah.
This is, like saying a pastoralist copes with the unpredictable climate and the aridity and the droughts is kind of like saying, well, the job of a fisherman is to cope with the sea. Well, the sea is there, and yes, you have to cope with it, but no, the fishermen are creating a livelihood. They're bringing food out of that resource, and if they're doing it sustainably, they're managing that resource and providing food for us and creating homes and livelihoods and cultures for themselves. And it's the same way for these pastoralists, even in like to my mind, harsh desert type climates. They're not just coping; they're living there. They're creating lives there, and have found ways to, over time, to adapt their culture to fit in that kind of climate. And I think that way of looking at it has a lot to offer those of us whether you're thinking about policy or you're thinking about on a personal level, what do I do about my own personal, climate footprint? I think we need to, especially those of us who are living in industrial societies or in urban setting, is to think a bit more and find ways to reestablish that human connection with ecosystems, because in sort of this in modern urban life, you get so disconnected from nature. And we start to see nature as a resource, and my field had natural resources in it, which I'm kind of sends the thinking in the wrong direction. Yes, it's, you know, we draw on resources, but the ecosystems, the biosphere, the world is not just a resource, it's our home. And I think we need to understand again that we're part of it, we're in it, and I think we have to learn how to live in a bit more harmoniously with it. But I think that kind of perspective of seeing it as a place I live in, and I'm working towards creating a livelihood in this world, creating lives and cultures and societies in this world that fit, that are matched with that ecosystem, is part of what we need to do as we try and work towards more sustainable ways of living.
Whoa, that was a lot. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're not unfortunately, but we have to move on to the next photo because it just goes by very quickly. But it's really interesting to me that we start off with this shot of the prairies, which are kind of alive and movement and the wind and you know you kind of hinted at the sort of the landscape and the habitats, and then the next image is of this people eking their lives out on a very rugged land. You had mentioned dune earlier. And so I'm just like, yes, you're studying the Fremen to figure out how they live, which I think
that's almost what it is. Yeah,
I think it's really interesting. Really, I'm sorry, just nerded out for a second, but we have to go on to the next photo. Lance, this is great. This is totally great. Next.
This is what writing looks like.
Okay, so in the image, you're in a room that may not have a window. It may have a window, but that's off camera. There's no art. It's a tight room. There's a laptop on a desk, and there are a whole bunch of files in a little kind of file holder. There's a kind of a telescopic light, like desk lamp. You're seated in a kind of a desk office chair. Behind you are two mirrors. Your glasses are on your face. You're seated back. Your eyes are closed. It looks almost like you're taking a nap or just taking a rest. Can't really tell what's on the screen of your laptop, but it looks kind of semi-officious. Yeah, your hands are kind of clasped across your stomach. You're resting. It makes me wonder who's making the photo. But yeah, like why this? What is this?
This is how I spend a lot of my time writing. I mean, there's a certain amount where I'm sitting up straight, I'm looking at the screen, or maybe I can touch type, so I don't always need to look at the screen, but often my fingers are on the keyboard.
Yep.
But that's about half the time. The other half of the time is I'm sitting in positions like this, leaning back, so either staring up at the ceiling or my eyes closed or whatever, just thinking, imagining, trying to work through the possibilities. As I mentioned, it's like the kind of literature that most attracted me is science fiction. And science fiction is the literature of possibilities. The wonderful, positive, what if we figure out how to do things better possibilities, and what if we get it all wrong and we take it to take this world to hell kind of possibilities, and then the other kind of weird possibilities in between. So thinking through some of those possibilities is how I spend a fair chunk of my writing time.
Yeah. So, okay. So in a sense, that kind of writing is sort of letting the connections reveal themselves to your consciousness, right? So just kind of flowing with this thing. You're playing in a sandbox and saying, okay, I'm just fiddling around, just making connections. You bump into a narrative problem, for example, and then you're like, okay, well, I wonder where that goes. So what's the question? The question is, how's this? How do you see the notion of revelation, not religious, not that, but revelation is in your eyes are closed, you're kind of sitting with an idea or a problem or a narrative kind of twist, and then suddenly a thought reveals itself and it occurs to you like, oh, wait a second, what about that direction? So why don't you talk about the role of that kind of revelation to the writer?
Sure. I'm starting to learn that there's not a sharp distinction or a dichotomy between planning details, making an outline, plotting out what direction your story is going to go, and the muses and intuition and lateral thinking and ideas, sort of appearing in your head out of the ether. I more and more find I'm in one way or another I'm doing both.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes different forms in different stories. One time I'll have an idea and then I'll sit down and scope out a plot, and I have an idea of where the story is going to go. But then I start writing, and the story itself starts to become more real, starts to take on a life of its own, and then it goes a new direction.
Mm-hmm.
Other times, I've got sort of a vague idea or a feeling or a metaphor that excites me, and I just start writing, and then sort of the planning part of my brain intersects itself after I've been working at it for a while. And both of those possibilities and other combinations of those happen, but all that planning, the outlining, there's this sort of dichotomy I often hear that and I hear it in like chat groups or Facebook groups of writers, and are you a plotter or a pantser? And rather, it's like, do you start with a plan and a plot and a detailed outline, and then you fill in the details, or do you write by the seat of your pants?
Mm-hmm.
And I more and more can't relate to the question anymore, because it's like a yin and yang that I'm doing both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me throw in okay. So one of the fashions in neuroscience at the moment is this notion that we don't have free will, right? Like Robert Sapolsky, such an amazing writer, will sit and sort of kind of discuss how, from the neuroscience side of the things, it's hard to say there is free will, because you can always go back to influences and roots and whatever. So in the case of writing, right, which is weaving sentences together that sometimes seat of your pants, it's kind of like, I don't know, this is just coming, bleh, you just barf it out. And sometimes it's a planning thing, right? But often it's a question of both. So has there been a moment where, and it's particularly with science fiction, because it's all about almost fantasy. It's about, pushing your creative sort of thought or whatever it is as far as it will go. So has there been a moment where you surprised yourself, where you're just like, where the hell did that come from? And speaking of Dune, it could have come from eating mushrooms, right? Like whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a short story I published quite a few years ago now, back more than 20 years ago. I was getting annoyed at rejection letters. So I was writing short stories and sending them off to different science fiction magazines, and you get lots of rejection letters. And I went through a dry spell of having no acceptances for quite a while, and I was getting annoyed. And sometimes when I would get feedback, or when I would read the sort of the guidelines or the editor's preferences, this is the kind of story we're looking for. I was reading a lot about, well, we want characters who solve problems. Mm-hmm. We want someone who is like an active, proactive kind of character who he or she is encountered with a problem, and then they work hard to solve it. And I don't know if maybe I interpreted what the editors were looking for incorrectly, but I was starting to get annoyed at that, and says I'm feeling dejected now. I'm having this sense of rejection, and I want to write something bleak. And I just, out of sort of spite, I thought of the magazine that most embodied that kind of a magazine. I can say the name. It was Analog magazine, one of the famous science fiction magazines, but it's one that's always leaned a bit more than some of the others towards hard science fiction, and perhaps in some ways sort of less character oriented stories and more interested in plot oriented stories. At least it was, back in the 80s and 90s. And that, in my annoyance, embodied I'm finding that annoying. So I sat down to write a story almost out of spite about a writer who is feeling sorry for himself. And I recognized that I was feeling a bit too much sorry for myself, but I wanted to write a story about a writer who's pessimistic and becoming cynical and is encountering magazines like this and hates it. And I wrote a story about that, and by the end of the time I got to the story, the character had transformed himself into solving problems in his battle against these magazines. And so he became the kind of character he didn't want to write about. And my story became a story about that kind of character. And it wasn't in my plans. And then part of the surprise too is 20 years later, like last year, Analog magazine accepted another story, not that story, because I'd already published that story. Analog magazine accepted a story I submitted to them. And I said, okay, this magazine that I was so annoyed at is one of my first sort of professional pay scale, bigger name science fiction publications.
Nice. So, well, maybe that's that disquiet, that frustration. I mean, I think for the task of the artist, you need to have, maybe you don't need it. Maybe it's just me saying it, but I would think that you need to have that little itch. You need to have that little, because in a sense, what is a story? A story typically has a crisis, something happens. So in a sense, your narrative in terms of writing and getting published just wasn't happening. And then you had this sort of crisis moment where you're just like, God damn it. How do I make this happen? How do I unblock this? And, so maybe that's the bigger story, is that, that's how you got to the next stage, right? Maybe as a learning.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a learning thing. It was a learning thing for me. And, but yeah, it worked out, and it worked out in a way that I wrote a story that went in a direction that I didn't quite expect. And there was some plotting and planning and sort of construction of the story, but there was also just intuition and following the characters in the situation, and to come up with something that I hadn't expected.
Is the room in the photo where you're leaning back with your eyes closed, dreaming, imagining, thinking of new lands, is that the room where you're in now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so what is your writing routine? Do you have a writing routine, or do you just write whenever you feel like it, or
I've still got a day job. I'm still doing the environmental social science research kind of work.
Wow.
That's what I'm doing 9 to 5. But so for writing fiction, I usually get a few hours in every Saturday and every Sunday, and 2 or 3 evenings a week, an hour or two. And once in a while, I'll force myself to wake up early at 5 a.m. I am a morning person, or at least at some point in my life I used to be, and I remind myself of that and force myself to get up. But normally, 2 or 3 weekday evenings a week, and then a few hours each Saturday and each Sunday.
Got it. Lance, I understand just the process of writing, and I'm looking at this photo. I'm hearing you talk about it. We're like brothers. So let's move on to the next photo. Okay, so I don't know. It could be a poster. It could be a promotional poster. It could be the jacket of a book or a cover. I'm not really sure, but it says at the top. Well, it's the image of a kind of feminine, elvish. It's very sci-fi, super sci-fi, of somebody standing on what looks like it could be a tusk coming out of the water. It's very, maybe not, maybe a tongue. Some weird kind of curled thing. This elven kind of person standing on it. The light is very kind of ethereal moonscape. In the far background is like a kind of an exposed moon, half, or a crescent moon sort of style. They're shooting stars. It says volume 40. The best news and fantasy short stories of the year. Yes, nice. L. Ron Hubbard presents Writers of the Future. 15 illustrated short stories, bonus stories, plus art and writing tips. Is your name? There are 4 or 5 names there, edited by Jody Lynn Nye. Okay, we're on this. What's this? Lance.
So, Writers of the Future is a contest that's been running for 40 years.
Wow.
I submitted a story to it last year. They judge the winners every quarter. So like the contest is quarterly.
Okay.
So I won first place in one of the quarters last year in 2023.
Nice.
And the top 3 finishers in each quarter have their stories included in the Writers of the Future anthology. So I've got a short story coming out in Writers of the Future Volume 40 in, I think, about 3 weeks from now is when the book is released.
Respect.
And this is the book cover.
That's great. What riches and glory comes along with this beyond being published?
So the Writers of the Future contest, like for the 12 winners, it's just this amazingly generous contest. They fly us out to Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
And there's a Los Angeles connection in the art on this cover that I'll talk about in a second. But they fly us out to Los Angeles, and we've got a week-long workshop taught by some of the top names in science fiction and fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So one of those is Robert J. Sawyer, fellow Canadian science fiction writer. He's one of the 2 lead instructors, and a few other big names in science fiction teach this course. A little bit on the business of writing, a little bit on marketing, a bit on the craft of writing, and so on. But yeah, a week long on this course, and then we've got the award ceremony at the end of the week. Of the 4 from each of the 4 quarters, the first place finishers, one of those 4 stories would be selected as the overall grand prize winner.
Oh, nice.
And, so yeah,
okay. So look, I see the name L. Ron Hubbard. I, of course, celebrated writer, but also celebrated. Some would call him a kook. The fact that you're going down to California, do I need to worry about you?
I'm not expecting I'll come back wearing a tinfoil hat or anything. Now, to be honest, so a lot of the people associated with the behind the contest are connected with Scientology.
Mm-hmm.
But the contest itself, like the writers who teach, the judges who judge the contest, are not. They're people with no particular connection to Scientology, other than they're connected to this contest, and the publisher, has a lot of the staff of the publishing company are Scientologists. But I mean, that was one of the things I checked out when I entered the contest. I wanted to see, what is this I'm getting into?
Yeah.
And it was pretty clear. This is a legit contest with, and not just the judges and the instructors in the course, but people who've won the contest in the past. Again, people with no particular connection to that movement or that religion, whatever you call it. Some of them have, after winning this contest, have then gone on to very successful careers in science fiction and fantasy.
Amazing.
And this contest was like an early milestone in their careers.
So I don't know the world of Lance Robinson, and look, your name is so memorable. It's basically it's like made for. It just really rolls off the tongue. So, do you have, like, how large is the corpus of your work? Like, do you have, because for example, I once had a Mercedes lackey, right? I think that's her name, Mercedes Lackey. And it turns we're talking, and it turns out she's written something like 400 novels. And I was like, what? So, who am I talking to, Lance? Like, okay, what's the body of your work?
So, yeah, nothing like that. I've written a couple novels that are sitting in drawers and haven't looked at them in a long time. I think if I go back and look at them again, they were written years ago when I was just starting out in my early days. I think if I went back and looked at them, I'd either decide it needs a lot of work or it's not worth working on. Most of my focus has been on short stories. I took a big hiatus in writing science fiction. I was writing in the late '80s and the '90s and early 2000s, but I gradually faded away from it. Had a family, had kids, moved to Kenya. Like after I did my PhD, ended up moving back there and lived there for 7 years.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, shifted continents, filled up part of my when I wasn't spending time with my kids. So I had different kind of community work I was doing. So for just various reasons, I shifted away from it. When I moved back to Canada about 4 years ago, that's when I said, no, I want to get back at this. I miss this. There's something. There's an itch I need to scratch, and so I started writing again. And I don't know if it was life experience or just the having some distance from having done it in the past or what it was, but the writing has been going so much better since then. So yeah, I've got a story coming out soon in Analog magazine, as I mentioned. It's coming out next month. I've got a story coming out in Writers of the Future. Back in the 80s and 90s, when I was first publishing short stories in different small press magazines and so on, I had about five or six short story publications. I've got a few other short stories I've written in the past couple of years are making the rounds, trying to find a magazine or an anthology or someone to publish them. And starting to work on a novel now.
For people who where it's like switches, right? So like the switches of science fiction, for some people, yes, that just kind of really does it for them. And for some people, absolutely not. It's just like whatever, doesn't really connect. How about you talk about what is it about science fiction specifically that because it's really interesting because when you first start talking about the sky, right? You were talking about like in the first photo, you're talking about possibility, right? It's like there's this notion of possibility, of potential, and to a certain extent, there's an optimism about it, right? So the optimism of science fiction, although some science fiction is quite, let's say, pessimistic, but why don't you talk about how optimism informs your worldview, I guess?
Sure. And I think, recently, I think a lot of the science fiction we see, and I might look at kinds of stuff that are coming out on Netflix these days, a lot of it is pretty bleak and apocalyptic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the world needs some hope now. And I think it needs some imagination. One novel that I was really impressed with was Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future. And again, that was my understanding from interviews I've read with him, and it fits with what I've read of his novel, is he felt this need to present, not in a intellectual argument, but in an art form, present the idea that as bleak and scary as climate change might be, we're not necessarily screwed.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's ways we can get ourselves out of this, but it does take a bit of imagination. And imagining possibilities is what science fiction is good at.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about Dune a couple times. One of the things that comes across in a lot of Frank Herbert's novels, and some of my favorite ones aren't part of his Dune series. The Dosadi experiment. If there's any science fiction readers among your listeners who want something that they might not have heard of before, the Dosadi experiment by Frank Herbert. He takes sort of the same kind of concept of the Fremen, this harsh climate environment, and what it does to a people's culture, and he takes that to like a greater extreme. What if there was like a hellhole of a planet, and what kind of culture would emerge on that hellhole planet? That just taking the possibilities and taking them to extreme, and whether it's like extreme and it becomes like just a thought experiment. There's no pretending that I think this is going to happen. If it's that kind of science fiction, it's set 10,000 or 100,000 years in the future. It's a thought experiment about the human condition, right? Or some science fiction is just really tightly extrapolated. It's stuff that is super probable. And in A Ministry for the Future, Stanley Robinson's novel from a few years ago, he took a look at a near future and he said, I'm going to take an optimistic look, but like realistic. Like, the climate science is, he doesn't sweep that under the rug or assume there's going to be some magical technological fix. He says, all right, what would us shifting the way we're hemming and hawing about climate change, what would that look like to make that shift that we actually start to do something about it? And he tells that with real human characters and real human stories. And that's some of what I want to do in my writing. I've written some bleak things, and I talked about that story I wrote years ago where I was in that sort of feeling sorry for myself kind of place. But most of the stuff I write is really positive and hopeful, because I think that's what the world needs now. That doesn't mean being unrealistic or pie in the sky or assuming there's going to be technological solutions that just pop out of a hat and save the day for us. I think human beings are capable of doing a lot of positive things and being good people, and taking forward this civilization that I think now we don't have civilizations anymore. We have one civilization. We've got one global civilization. And I think it's possible for us to do better than we're doing. And I think we can. And I think eventually we will. Part of my job as a science fiction writer is to imagine that. And sometimes I imagine, what if we don't? But there's enough people writing that kind of science fiction that I don't need to spend much of my time imagining what if we get it all wrong. So I'm mostly trying to imagine, what if we get it right, and what does it look like whether it's at the level of an individual person, one character in the story making the right decision, or it's a whole society or a whole culture. What does that look like? That's what I try and do with my fiction.
That's great. Okay, well, Lance, actually, what you described just then was right down the alley of the podcast. Really, it's kind of like, okay, we are surrounded by arguably tough times, challenge, all this stuff, and the podcast is about inspiring and uplifting, making every second count. And yeah, so I think you kind of said it really beautifully in a way that you can choose to go the path of optimism without it being pie in the sky or a delusion of sorts. Yeah, thanks. I mean, this has been a really great conversation, and I'm absolutely, yeah. So the link to your work will be in the show notes, and yeah, this is great. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Okay, great. Represent for Canada. Enjoy that. Is Thunder Bay now really cold? Is it is getting better? Warming up?
No, it's quite warm. It's up. It's around 8 or 9 or 10 degrees. Or you're in a place where that's cold, right? No, it's beautiful. Winter's over.
I left Canada in middle of, we decided in February, okay, screw this, Montreal's way too cold, we're out of here. So right now it's 30 degrees outside, and you're just like, no, it's warm, warm. It's like 8 degrees, which is winter in Hong Kong. I love it. Okay, well, on that buoyant note, have a fantastic evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw.